Welcome to Heaven and Earth. I'm joined with Jerry Shepard, and we are here to talk about the book of Leviticus. Jerry has a commentary on Wright that I'm sure we'll talk about and can maybe put a pre-order link if it's a pre-order time when this releases. As we get going, Jerry, do you mind just kind of introducing yourself in a way that seems appropriate for the conversation?
Sure. As Wyatt has said, my name is Jerry Shepard. I'm originally from the U.S., from North Carolina. Went to Westminster Seminary, got my master's and PhD there. And then while I was working on the dissertation stage, got gainful employment at what was called at that point Edmonton Baptist Seminary in Edmonton, Alberta, and later became Taylor Seminary in the 2000s. And I've been here at Taylor teaching in the area of Old Testament hermeneutics, Hebrew, and biblical theology for I'm finishing up my 28th year now.
28 years at one place.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I think in an academic world, that's actually pretty long, isn't it?
I guess it depends. I didn't see any reason to go anywhere else. I'm also pretty well tied to the Edmonton area. We have 3 grown children, and we have 3 grandchildren, all living in the area. I have no interest in going anywhere else.
Well, and you kind of know this, but my family's all basically in the Edmonton area. So Alberta, Edmonton as well. So, and that's I grew up in Alberta, at least in part.
Okay.
So where in North Carolina are you from?
I was born in Greensboro.
Okay.
And had just a wonderful time living there. And in fact, at one point, given all the various factors that you can weigh in, Greensboro was chosen to be the greatest place in the U.S. to live by the JC organization. And then so lived in Greensboro all my life until I went to Bible college, which was in Winston-Salem, only about 30 miles away, and then did some work there. And after college, did some odd kind of things in that area, and eventually decided to go to seminary and went to Westminster. And I went there for the express purpose of going into Old Testament studies. And,
so Westminster, Philadelphia, right?
Right.
And who did you study with at the? Because was this like the 80s, 90s? What decade
This was
is this?
I was there in the Philadelphia area from 1983 to 1993.
Okay.
And stellar cast of profs there. I'm sure you've heard of most of them. Tremper Longman, of course. One of
the third.
Yes, Tremper Longman III, one of the deans of Old Testament scholarship in North America. I learned Hebrew and also worked with J. Allen Groves, and his big claim to fame, I guess, in terms of academics, is that he was the major driver behind what's called the Westminster Hebrew Computer Project. And so if you buy Accordance or Logos, the morphological text in that program is the result of his direction.
Yeah, the WHS tagging, right?
Yes, right. Yeah. And then, of course, one of my favorite pros there was Ray Dillard, just a fantastic scholar, teacher, gentleman.
He's like an Old Testament introduction or something, right?
Yeah, well, Tremper and Ray co-wrote an introduction. He also wrote the Chronicles commentary for the Word series and a lot of other stuff, but those are probably the 2 most popular things that he has written, probably. And then at one point, I was during my time there, Bruce Waltke was also there. Oh. And in fact, I started off my doctoral studies under Bruce Waltke, and then about the time I got to the dissertation stage, He left to go back to Regent College. So he ended up finishing the PhD under Trimber.
Interesting. So you've now done some work in Leviticus. You're doing a commentary on it. Now I read it last night. It's a bit fresh in my mind. So I have, there's a number of things we could start with. Maybe just one kind of a fun question is,
Sure.
so in North America and Canada, we're living under numerous types of restrictions on our life. I think it's interesting that we struggle with these. I suspect most of us, given if it was just today, would struggle to live under the Levitical outlines for life. I mean,
Mhm.
it tells you what food you can and cannot eat, what fish you can and cannot eat, or sea creatures more accurately, I suppose.
Mhm.
It tells you like how to treat skin disease or mildew in a house. If you touch anything dead or anything that is polluted, you're unclean and can't participate in worship, at least for a short time.
Mhm.
And if you remain unclean for a certain reason, you not only can't participate in worship, like you have to go outside of the camp and stay there, maybe
Mhm.
indefinitely or until
Mhm.
you've somehow become clean again.
Yes.
And so there's all sorts of things where like your kind of personal liberty and ability to do what you want is deeply constrained by the patterns of life outlined in, well, not just Leviticus, but I suppose Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in particular, but Leviticus mostly, I would say. I think is Leviticus. There's also have clothing in there too. There's different kinds of clothing you can wear, and you can't mix them. Or is that Numbers?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So maybe just talk about like just generally about that, because I think a lot of us have some semblance of our freedoms being constrained. Why was it so constrained in the book of Leviticus? Like what? Why?
I think that one of the things, and we may get to talk about some of this a little bit more later in the context of sacrifice, but one of the important things about Leviticus is that there's a ritual, symbolic world against which that book is set, and which against life in ancient Israel was set. And that ritual, symbolic world entailed the idea that there was a connection between um, impurity, sin, and death. And whenever you put yourself in a place where you um, contacted impurity, even though you may not have sinned in doing that, nevertheless, you've still, your life is now intersected with the world of death and sin. And therefore, there's a purification that needs to be put in place. And in fact, one of the interesting things in this regard is that whole area of the woman who gives birth to a child and has to offer a purification offering. Or I think the better, I still retain this term in my commentary. I retain the term sin offering for it, as opposed to purification offering. Now, she hasn't sinned in giving birth to a child. Uh, in fact, some of the ancient rabbis tried to come up with all kinds of different ways in which she actually had sinned. But I think it's safe to say that in the process of giving birth to a child, she has not sinned, but because of the loss of blood and because of coming into contact with the realm of death, and you think back, to thousands of years ago, the mortality rate for women, giving birth to a child was much higher than it is in our more modern medical society. So she's come into contact with that realm, and because she needs to offer this sin offering. Um, it's for purification for her, but it's also called a sin offering because she's come into contact with that realm of impurity and sin and death. So that's the kind of things that stand behind this. And just to give a shameless plug here, I have a blog called The Recapitulator. And one of the things we might do when you put this up is just to give some links, because early on last year, when this stuff set in around March or April, I was asked to address this whole COVID thing in the light of Leviticus, and I wrote 3 or 4 articles on that, and covering all kinds of things, such as why it was so important. Did God send the COVID crisis? Things like that. So,
well, so I was actually going to ask you about the offering the woman has to do, because yeah, it is translated as a sin offering. I can't remember the Hebrew word. It's like chat or something like that.
chatat, yeah.
Chata, okay. And so you can translate it a number of ways. You've retained sin offering. And by the way, if you're just listening to this, if you read the beginning part of Leviticus, I think in the first few chapters, their sin offerings are listed there as well. It's the same word. So you'd be consistent throughout. And yet you're telling me, and I think it makes sense, that it's not so much of an individual person's demerit of sin, but rather they're contaminated by pollutants of some sort.
Right.
So maybe my question is, why do we keep the word sin offering then? Or is it the case that maybe we need to kind of redefine our understanding of the word sin, at least according to the book of Leviticus?
Yeah, good question there. In my commentary on Leviticus, I retained those traditional names for 2 reasons. First of all, the commentary is based, or the Story of God commentary series in which the commentary I wrote appears, is based on the NIV text 2011.
Mm-hmm.
And the 2011 NIV still retains those traditional names: burnt offering, grain offering, fellowship offering, sin offering, and guilt offering. And so, to avoid confusing the reader, I retained those traditional titles. But I also did it by conviction, because I do think that even though we refer to it as even though much of modern scholarship says it should be called a purification offering, I think we lose something by simply focusing in on purification and not realizing that connection to sin. And we also lose the wordplay, I think, going on in the Hebrew at the same time. And in fact, one of the things I point out is that one of the modern, very academic, technical commentaries written on Leviticus in the last few years is still in process, but it's written by James Watts, and he argues that we should retain that term sin offering just for those very reasons. So I agree with him on that, and I think it's better to retain that, just so that we know that in the back of the minds of the priests and the Levites who were handling all this material and manipulating the blood and performing atonement, in their minds they have this sin, death, impurity connection working in the background.
So that's a good something camp on this. So you said sin, death, purity.
Yeah, right.
Now, just as someone who is maybe thinking of New Testament categories, I know that that's not necessarily what you always need to do, but sin and death and holiness or purity are pretty big deals in the New Testament. So
yes,
if I think of the book of Hebrews, for example, it seems different than how Paul describes atonement. Not contradictory, that's not my point, but different. In that, often you have the idea of sprinkling and blood and purification happening. Then after the purification happens, Christ sits down at the right hand of God. Seems like Hebrews is getting the idiom pretty directly from Leviticus.
Yes.
So if you could, maybe tell me how those things, because you mentioned they relate. So how do death, purity, and sin relate, at least in the book of Leviticus? Then maybe more broadly, if you have some sort of bigger picture thoughts.
Well, again, first of all, just that basic idea that there is this sin impurity connection. The reason there is impurity in the world is because there's sin in the world. The reason we have impurity is because of sin. and they both connect up with the idea of death. Sin results in death. When we come to the New Testament, I think it's important to recognize that that impurity concept is still retained. It's retained spiritually. So you've got a kind of a kind of a transferal from the physical to the spiritual that takes place. But the physical has not been lost either. And of recently, there have been just a number of scholars who have argued quite strongly that when we come to the Gospels, for example, and Jesus is healing people who have contracted some kind of skin disease, or they have an issue of blood, or some kind of hemorrhaging, such as you have described in Leviticus, that when Jesus interacts with those people, he doesn't cancel the impurity system. He doesn't do away with it. He heals the person who's impure. And even in the Gospels, that's a very, very huge deal there. Recently, Matthew Thiessen, who is a professor of Old Testament at McMaster University, has written a whole book on this area. It's entitled Jesus and Death. I forget the exact title now, but those words loom in the title: Jesus and the realm of death, something like that. And he has argued quite strongly that Jesus was an observant Jew. He did not come for the purpose of setting aside the purity laws. Now, that may eventually happen, but that was not his deal. He did not consider the impurity laws or the laws about purity. He did not consider that, as you sometimes read in the literature, to be some kind of oppressive system that holds people down. He doesn't come to get rid of it. He comes to heal those who are impure. Very different take, I think, on what Jesus is doing there. And then when you come to the book of Hebrews, there's more that's taking place there as well. And I can say more about that, but maybe you were about to ask a question, I think.
Well, so what comes to mind then is, look, if we are going to say impurity is linked to sin, and impurity in the gospel books, and really here in Leviticus, is really tied to something we would call it sickness, right? Or disability.
Mm-hmm.
Is Leviticus teaching that sickness and disability is sin?
It's not teaching that it's a sin, but it is in some way connecting the two. In other words, a person who has a disability, and this plays out quite prominently, for example, in Leviticus 21 and 22, where you have a list of defects for a priest who, if they have one of these defects, they can't be a priest. That is, they can't enter into the realm of the holy. And again, it's not because they've sinned, but it's because they have a defect that has now caused them to come into contact with the realm of sin and death. And because of that, again, it's that ritual, symbolic background to the book. Now, I think those things do, in fact, change when we come to the New Testament. But at least in the world of Leviticus, that's the reason for it. A potential priest is not sinful because they have a defect, but nevertheless, they can't fulfill their role in that ritual symbolic system.
Yeah, and maybe another way to look at it is, so if I look at a woman who has a child, she has 7 days where basically she's impure. After that, she enters into blood purity for 33 days, or I guess technically, depending on if it's a male or female child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't think anyone, as you noted earlier, I don't think anyone's saying that she's sinning.
Right.
And yet, through water and blood, all this kind of process, she is connected to the sphere of death and sin.
Mhm.
And I mean, maybe one way to look at it and maybe actually, well, let me ask you the question instead of me trying to say what it looks like. Is this because blood is connected to life? Leviticus, I think 19 makes that argument,
Blood
right?
is, yes, yes. Blood is connected to life, but the shedding of blood is connected to death. And because of that, it's that whole idea of having gone down into you come into contact with, as it were, the underworld, I guess, to a certain extent, we could put it that way. Um, one of the stories I tell in my commentary is about one of my professors when I was in Bible college, and he said something that I think that he did not realize how true it was that he said when he said it. Um, he was a Welshman and had the accent, and so I can't produce that accent in what he said, but he had when all his classes, and it was primarily men in the classes, and he would say to us, "Okay, preacher boys, listen carefully. You show respect for your mothers, because don't forget, when your mother gave birth to you, she went down into the jaws of hell to do so." now, now that's an interesting, quaint way of maybe archaic way of seeing it, but whether he realized it or not, he actually got the idea in Leviticus 12 right. In order for the mother to give birth, she has come into contact with that, with um, as best as you can express it in the Old Testament. She's come into contact with uh, the world of I'm not sure if I want to say demons, but she's come into contact with a world that is characterized by death and impurity and sinister forces, and therefore she has to have that purification offering, that sin offering.
So I almost want to kind of push you on one aspect. I have another
Sure.
question I'll ask you, but you're saying maybe not the realm of demons, and yet in chapters 16 and 17 you have Azazel,
Yes.
and then the
Yes.
goat demon in chapter 17 who's associated with the wilderness. And my reading of Leviticus, my understanding rather, is that the further you get from the tabernacle, the closer you are to death, essentially, or
Right.
unclean, right? So
Yes.
if the demons, the goat demon, or demons, I can't remember, is it plural or singular? I can't remember. Whatever, the goat
Um,
demons, let's just say,
yes.
are in the wilderness, that's where death is. There's a real sense that when you're experiencing or close to death, you're near the demonic
Right.
realm, in
Yes.
sphere, or
Yeah.
whatever you want to call
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. A couple of things I could say there. First of all, one of the points you'll often find made in commentaries in Leviticus is that there's been a kind of a transformation in how sacrifice works. And in other civilizations, quite often the sacrifice had what's known as an apotri, I can't remember, I can't say the word now, an apotriarchate. That is, it was not so much pointed toward deities as it was pointed toward demons. By offering a sacrifice, you were warding off the demonic. Now that takes on a different character in the biblical text. We're not dealing with demons here. We're dealing with the one God of Israel. And yet that one God of Israel is a dangerous God, just like C.S. Lewis says about
Well, the lion.
Aslan. Yeah, yeah. And so that there is either actual or potential wrath there that the sacrifice is dealing with. Now, when we come to what you mentioned with regards to Leviticus 16 and 17, Leviticus 17 refers to the goat demons, and that's because, interestingly, at at the very same time as the Israelites were involved in the ritual system of sacrifice spelled out in Leviticus, they were also being idolatrous. I mean, we have an example of that, for example, with the golden calf. And we have example of it in Joshua, where Joshua is speaking to the Israelites who have had at least a somewhat glorious experience of conquering the promised land and in the conquest, and yet he in Joshua 24 he tells them, okay, you need to get rid of all the gods you are worshiping, whether it's the gods on the other side of the river or on this side. You need to get rid of them. Well, that's interesting. They would keep up that idolatrous worship along with this. So Leviticus
And in
7.
Leviticus, they're warned against passing their children through to Moloch.
Yes,
Or
exactly.
Molech,
That comes through as well. So
I think.
as the way this comes into contact with the Day of Atonement, I believe, is that there are several theories as to what the scapegoat is, and I'm not going to go into all of them here, but I think I'm pretty much persuaded by the idea that we have two goats talked about in Leviticus 16, one for Yahweh, and that's the one that sacrificed, and then one for Azazel, who probably should be thought of as a goat demon in the wilderness. And that the goat for Azazel, in essence, what happens is that after the sacrifice has taken place and the sins have been dealt with in that regard, now they're all placed on this goat, and the goat is sent out to the wilderness to return the sins back to where they came from in the first place. So it kind of portrays Azazel as the major force behind all impurity and sin that the Israelites are coming into contact with.
I don't know if this is connected. Just a resonance popped in my mind that when Christ, the sin bearer, dies on the cross, he's understood to descend to Hades, to hell, the place of death. And anyways, I don't know if there's a resonance that's actually useful. It's just interesting to me that you kind of see a similar thing in the Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur in Hebrew. Anyways, in the back of my mind. Okay, so you have these two goats. One is for Yahweh, and that would be to perpetuate him. Okay.
Yeah. And to achieve, it also achieves purification for the tabernacle and or temple.
Right. Then you have a goat for Azazel, and that is this the one where the priest puts his hand on the head of that goat?
Right.
And then you might think there's some sort of symbolic transference happening.
Yes. Yeah.
I think yesterday I was looking at someone and I heard it said that basically on the Day of Atonement it's almost like a smog of pollution.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of cleansed out on the Day of Atonement. It leaves the tabernacle and is cast into the wilderness. And I guess that would be on the Azazel goat. You also have a bull, right? So the bull is sacrificed as well for the priest. Is that correct? Or am I mis?
I'm sorry. Yes, exactly. So there's sin offerings and burnt offerings that are offered that day. So the priest's sins have to be atoned for, as well as the congregation. And so what I think happens there is again that the sin and the burnt offerings, and the burnt offering was a propitiatory sacrifice. It was for the purpose of, again, averting the wrath of the deity and securing his favor. So they all kind of work together there. And then those sins for which that first goat and or bull is sacrificed are now placed on the so-called scapegoat and removed. So
right.
Those two things kind of work together.
Yeah, so I see two he-goats, one ram, and one bull. Interesting.
Yes, it's actually a quite complicated thing to work out in terms of the actual
what happened,
chronological structure and order that happens that day.
So let me ask you that. I mean, that's an interesting observation. So when I read the Torah in particular, so more or less actually the end of Exodus and the rest of the books, through Numbers, I don't really see a comprehensive outlining of things. I see almost like whatever they found to be theologically or liturgically relevant included. But there's so much missing, as you noted, in terms of like what actually happens. How do they
Yeah,
actually do the thing here? So to me, that suggested that we should read this more like a theology work rather than like naked history. And the reason why is because it seems to include mainly this whatever was salient to them, and it excludes so many things that we'd be curious about were it to be sort of like merely a manual for practice. Like presumably
yeah.
they had an oral tradition and maybe other documents for to figure out some of the details. Is that kind of
hmm
does that match up with your experience?
I think that works pretty well. One of the ancient names for the book uh, that was fastened on by some of the rabbis was this is a this is the book of the priests. It's a manual for them as to how they are to carry out the sacrifices and the rituals and the blood manipulation and all that. And yet so interestingly, there are details that just escape us. Um, uh, and maybe they are taken for granted by the writers or by the editors as they put the material together. But there are places where we just don't have a complete understanding of what's happening. One example, for instance, would be the fellowship offering. In Leviticus 3, you have the fellowship offering being described, and you would think you would have an explanation there, but it's not till about 3 or 4 chapters later that we are actually told that this is an offering that the people who bring it can eat of. They can dine on what they brought that day. It's not mentioned in Leviticus 3, so you had to read later on, and you sort of wonder, well, why isn't it there in chapter 3? But it isn't. And then I guess additionally, a little bit different emphasis here, um, and this is why there are so many differences between commentaries, is that there are just a ton of places where you could wish that the writer told us, okay, why not? What does the sacrifice actually accomplish? Why are these foods clean and these foods aren't clean? And it'd be great to have an explanation, but there isn't one. So at least it keeps us those of us who were in the field, it keeps us involved, making money writing commentaries and articles and dissertations, trying to figure out what it is.
Well, it's one of the interesting things that I think most of us assume we know everything. And then when you read a book like Leviticus, you're like, I barely like there's so much we don't know that happens.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
did everyone actually come once? Like what were the festivals actually like? How do the sacrifices actually like how do people know about it? Or even for me, like, okay, so you're unclean, so you leave the camp. So where are you living if you're outside the camp? And then also, if you become clean, you're expected to offer livestock.
hmm
So where are you keeping livestock? Right? I mean, you could have a bird too, but like or whatever the exception is. But like so it's like so are you if you're outside the camp, does it just mean that you're like in the suburbs? You know what I mean? Like
Well, it wouldn't be a very pleasant sort of neighborhood at that point. I think that one of the things that perhaps lies behind this is that there were very few isolated families, that they were, they you weren't just a family, but you belonged to a tribe and a clan, and if you were isolated, there were other people in the clan who would take care of your affairs for you and keep that livestock for you, etc. So,
well, even the
but
amount of sacrifices that are implied, it seems like in a rural community, like you'd run out of animals, like livestock, or you'd not run out. Well, possibly, like it does seem like a lot of killing constantly.
it does, and there have been all kinds of suggestions as to whether or not some of these figures are on the hyperbole side. Are they exaggerated somewhat? Even as it has been suggested that the numbers for the population in the Exodus, those might be either hyperbolic, exaggerated, or there's some kind of different computational system that's being used with regards to what counts. Maybe the word thousand doesn't mean thousand. Maybe it means a small clan or tribe.
Right. Well, that's an interesting. I'm not really even, but that would make sense. I could see that being an argument. Well, it's just so interesting to me. Now, we did talk about being outside the camp. You can be in the camp, and then there's a tabernacle in the camp. So it does seem to be outlaying something like sacred space, or polluted space, or pollution coming into sacred space. Today, I think, at least if we live in North America, nobody would think like this. Well, sorry, no one born in Canada would, probably. Maybe the US. If I go to church or if I'm at my neighbor's, I don't think there's anything like sacred, polluted space. And yet, Leviticus, I think very explicitly does view the world as full of, as someone has said, like, I think many people probably have, miasma, the sort of invisible pollutants that are connected to sin, sure, but really ritual impurity, because it's not so much individual sin. Like, I could touch something impure, and then that's commuted to me. Or I could touch, I think, and if I remember right, something, I think it is right, something pure, and then be purified from touching that thing. I'm reminded, by the way, when that I think a woman touches the hem of Jesus's garment.
Yes.
And then there's actually a transference, and Jesus is like, I felt my power go.
Right.
But it was a purifying thing. And you think of him as the mobile tabernacle. It's interesting.
Oh yes.
But nonetheless, let's go back to the sacred space idea. So you're talking about the symbolic world. Do these symbols, in fact, speak of something real, or do they symbolize something merely metaphorical to help us understand sin and redemption? In other words, is the miasma something real that attaches to us?
Yeah, well, a great question, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for it.
I mean, it's theological, I know, so it's not quite. But
I really think it's more ritually symbolic. All kinds of things could have been chosen to fasten on as to what is impure and what's not. I think that part of what's involved here is, that famous, phrase from John Calvin, where he talks about how God has accommodated himself to our capacities. And he even goes so far as to say God stoops down to us as if we were little children, lisps to us. And I think some of that has to be understood here as well. Accommodations to the context in which the Israelites lived. And there's no two ways around it. Israel lived in a context where other civilizations also had ritual, symbol, conceptions of impurity and purity. And I'm not trying to say that when God accommodates here, that's simply arbitrary, but I think that God chose to reveal himself to a people in a context where these things mattered, and he used those ideas of ritual and symbol and purity and impurity and holy and versus profane. He used those categories that were already in existence, but those categories are in existence also because he is the Lord of history, and they were already present in the civilizations around because God oversaw that whole thing. And so to speak as of whether these things are real or not, I think they're real to the people who have to deal with them. I guess I could put it that way. And it once you come up with this symbolic system, then it makes a lot of sense in order to see the Israelites as responding to God as He has given them commands within that system. It does not necessarily mean that that system is going to hold forever and ever. Now, just to give you an example here, you mentioned earlier the whole idea about two kinds of clothing. And for an awful long time, commentators said, what is so evil about putting two kinds of clothing together? If I have a cotton polyester blend in my t-shirt, is that something all that horrible? And what I think more recently scholars have recognized is that the very thing that God tells the Israelites not to do is the very thing that God did do in the tabernacle and in the priestly clothing. The tabernacle had curtains that were woven of two kinds of material. The priest's clothing was as well. And so what's going on there? Well, it's this ritual symbolic world where the holiness of the tabernacle is not to be profaned by making it common everyday dress among the Israelites. Now, once you do away with that kind of ritual symbolism, once that falls in the background, then those kinds of rules don't come down to us today. So we don't have that kind of idea that there are things that we do in our everyday lives that are reserved for, or the things that we had to stay away from in our everyday lives that are reserved for some other realm. We don't have that concept here today.
So if this richly symbolic world that is tied to the cult, or the you didn't use the word cult, to the ritual system,
Mm-hmm.
if it's this whole thing about profaning, polluting, being separate in the sense of dividing yourself and all that, there does seem to be a pretty massive change in the economy of the new covenant.
Right.
In particular, like in Acts 10, all things are clean. Jesus will teach. It's not what
Mm-hmm.
it's not what from without, but what comes from within that reveals your heart and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So what in now, I think a lot of people listening probably know the sin dealing effects of the cross. Something at the cross, death, resurrection, ascension, whatever, however you want to tie that together, changes this ritual system, or at least the way in which pollutants work. Can you make that connection? Is there a way to kind of think about what's new and different? Why Acts 10 is in the Bible, where the animals come on the not the carpet, that's the wrong word, the curtains,
Yeah,
3 times, yeah,
carpet.
and all things are declared clean, like all things, right? Like shellfish,
Mm-hmm.
pig, etc. Why are they clean? Like what cleanses them?
Yeah. I have not completely worked that out in my head by any means. And this is a question that I guess plagues commentators who are working in both testaments, both in Leviticus but also in the New Testament. The best thing that I have really been come up with is that there are lots of continuities between the testaments, but there are also discontinuities, and those discontinuities are quite often accounted for because of a change in what makes up the people of God. So you go from a theocracy in the Old Testament to a church in the New Testament that is not completely apolitical, but it's certainly in in its most, I guess, official type aspects, is no longer a country, no longer a theocracy in terms of having its own borders and geographical boundaries, etc. It now is a pilgrim wandering people of God in the world. And at least to some extent, these things change in the New Testament to accommodate the idea that we are now taking this gospel in a very, very intentional way to the world of the Gentiles. There was some of that in the Old Testament, but not like you have in the New.
Well, as we kind of work towards the end of our conversation, can I ask you just like a few questions that are maybe to kind of like in fast order, just to kind of just hear your
Sure.
basic thoughts?
Sure.
Nadab and Abihu, what do they do wrong?
Good question. There are about a dozen different things that have been mentioned in the commentaries as to what they did wrong. I tend to fasten on the idea that they used a different kind of formula for the incense. They profaned the tabernacle by entering in with incense that was not the right form, the right concoction.
In chapter 24, there's 12 loaves, and there's a lot of things going into these 12 loaves. What's the deal with the 12 loaves? Like, why are, I mean, I understand that there are 12 tribes, but like, what is the symbolism inside the tabernacle? Why are they're focused on so much? Like, what's the big deal of 12 loaves?
Well, I think you're right. Part of that is the fact that this is a community contribution. The community offered the oil for the lamps, and they bring the bread for the loaves. So I think that's part of the reason for the 12. That raises another issue, by the way, because at least in theory, these loaves are they're on the table of the bread of the presence. It's food for God, and that raises a whole category, not just of the loaves, but of course of the sacrifices. And you bring these sacrifices, and is it food for God? Does he eat? Does he consume? The same thing is true of the bread. And what actually happens for the most part is with these sacrifices, the priests are the one who end up eating whatever edible portions are left, and they, as it were, they are the imago Dei. They are the imitatio Dei. They represent God when they eat the food, the sacrifices, and the bread.
Do you think it was the rookie priest who had to eat the stale bread?
Maybe. Yeah, they had to work their way up.
In Leviticus 26, is this a unique covenant being described, or is it just part of the Mosaic covenant made with Israel?
Well, I think Leviticus 26 corresponds pretty well to what you have in Deuteronomy 27 and 28, all the curses that come against the people. By the way, since you raised that issue in Leviticus 26, one of the things that I do in my commentary, and I take my impetus here from Ephraim Radner, who teaches at Wycliffe College on the U of T campus. And he very intriguingly suggests that we can go through all of the curses in Leviticus 26 and understand them as culminating in what Paul says in Corinthians about Christ becoming a curse for us, and that we should read that chapter in the light of Christ's passion. And so he very tantalizingly suggests Leviticus 26 ought to be a Holy Week reading. And so one of the things I do in my commentary is that I take those curses that are laid out and try to show how each one of them has a resonance, has a mirror in Christ's own sufferings.
In the book of Revelation, incense is identified as the prayer of the saints going up to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same in Leviticus? What's incense doing in Leviticus?
Well, certainly is making that connection, as well as the sacrifices, as well as the grain offerings, which have their odors or their aromas. I think the incense plays a role in establishing a relationship between God and the people. It's a pleasing aroma for Him.
Mm.
By the way, one of along with that whole idea of the incense, I think one of the interesting metaphors that the tabernacle system brings is the idea, first of all, the tabernacle is where God dwells. And when the priest goes into the tabernacle, and not just the high priest, but also the other priests, their duties are to make sure there's bread on the table, the bread of the presence. They have to keep the candlestick burning, the lights on the candelabra, and they have to keep the incense. They had to have that aroma. So in a very real way, when you think of the priests, their role in the tabernacle is that of God's valets. They keep the bread on the table, they keep the lights going, they keep the aromatherapy going, and all of that together makes the tabernacle a place where God can be welcomed among the people.
So they used essential oils.
Essential oil, that's right. Yes. And
so
maybe I used the wrong essential oil. They used an inferior.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, you can't use the wrong one. Last question. So purifying agents are fire, water, blood, and oil. What do each symbolize?
Oh,
if they do.
Yeah, I don't know. Certainly the blood is representative of life. Life that has been, not just life, but life that has been poured out, that has been shed. Water plays a role in all ancient civilizations as naturally, I guess, as something you clean up in. Yeah. Fire, that's another very interesting one. Fire purifies, it burns the dross away. By the way, let me just mention this. You might not have originally thought this, but have you heard of Katherine Sonderegger, theologian at Virginia Theological Seminary? And in the second volume of a series of volumes that she is producing on theology, in the second volume of her series, she spends about 150 pages in the book of Leviticus, dealing with the sacrificial system and the fire that comes from God and that returns back to Him. And she actually situates the doctrine of the Trinity in Israelites' sacrificial system. And she does it not by focusing on the persons. So as Fred Sanders says, one of the premier Trinitarian theologians of our day, as Fred Sanders says, in what Sonderegger does, she doesn't necessarily count 1, 2, 3. She doesn't necessarily come up with 3 persons, but she comes with the processions, and says the sacrificial system, the fire that comes from God and consumes the sacrifices, and then returns to Him as the burnt offering, the fragrant aroma to Him, that sets the groundwork for the doctrine of the Trinity. So it's a fascinating suggestion, and I haven't done it justice in what I just explained, but interesting things she does there.
Yeah, I don't have that second. I have the first volume, not the second. Now I want to read it more, I suppose. So I think that's helpful. It's a good place to kind of end, but I want to, as we end, ask you, tell me about your commentary, like when it comes out and all that kind of, what
Sure.
it's part of, other publications you have, and then maybe like 2 or 3 recommendations on the book of Leviticus to help people kind of, the Bible itself, obviously, but like the works that can help you understand what's being said, like commentaries or special works.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, the commentary appears in the Story of God commentary series coming out from Zondervan. And there have been a number of volumes that have already come out, both in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Trimper Longman is the editor for the series. And each commentary, as it goes through the various passages, deals with 3 things. First of all, you set the passage that you're looking at in the context of the narrative flow of the Bible. In other words, we're dealing here with the story of God. And so how does each passage contribute to this grand narrative that we have? And that also then relates to what you do later on in the more application part of the passage, because we're not so much asking the question, what does this passage have to do with me? But what does it have to do with God's story, and how do we fit into that story? So you set each passage in the context of the grand narrative of Scripture, as well as the ancient Near East. Then secondly, you take time on the passage to explain what the passage is all about, and just give a running commentary. But then a great deal of attention was encouraged for us, and I welcomed it very much, to spend the major part of our time looking at how that passage then anticipates what we have going on in the rest of the Old Testament, in the New Testament, in the Gospel, and how that passage has application for the 21st century church, 21st century Christian, 21st century society. And so that was the way it's constructed. So the commentary that I've written follows that structure laid out, and I'm not sure, but percentage-wise, I think I spent most of my time in that third category, how these things are realized in the New Testament. The commentary comes out in July, and like I said, other volumes have come out, and then just recently, the most recent volume to come out is Christopher Wright's commentary on Exodus, and I'm reading through it now. It's just a sheer delight to read. He's such a good writer and so insightful, and really brings out the narrative that lays behind the text. One of the things that I think is so important about Leviticus, by the way, is that I really see. I taught a class in the midst of writing the commentary on Leviticus, and one of the things that I told my class was that part of my goal in the class was to persuade them that Leviticus is the most important book they will ever read. Most important book of the Bible, most important book they will ever read. And one of the things that really emphasizes that is that when you look at the book of Leviticus, basically it covers a 1-month period of instruction in ancient Israel. And you think of the Pentateuch, a full book is taken up with just these instructions. In fact, when you come to Exodus 19 through Numbers 10, that huge chunk, 40% of the Pentateuch, is taken up with just 1 year. And that's how important that material is in the Torah. So anyway, you asked about other things I've done. I wrote a commentary on Ecclesiastes for the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Revised Edition. And then aside from that, I've written a number of articles for the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis, and also some articles for the Baker illustrated Bible dictionary. And so those are the things I've been involved in.
Is there one other book that maybe you haven't written but really benefited from when you're studying Leviticus that you could recommend?
Oh, there are just so many good commentaries on Leviticus. Uh, First of all, I would simply say that Gordon Wenham, Jay Sklar, Roy Game, those are probably my favorite commentators on the book, and I would certainly recommend them. Samuel Ballantyne wrote a book entitled The Torah's Vision of Worship, and just an outstanding book situating the ritual material that you have in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, situating that material in the context of the ancient Near East and in the context of the entire Torah. And then Tremper Longman, a very accessible book entitled Emmanuel in Our Place, Seeing Christ in Old Testament Worship. So those are some background type volumes that would be very beneficial for the reader to access.
Great. Well, thanks, Jerry. That was fun. Thanks for chatting with me about Leviticus and from letting me learn from you. It was a good time.
Well, I enjoyed talking with you as well. Thanks for all the questions and even the ones that I have to think about some more.